Michael Harris sat in his car outside the house he had shared with Rachel for 10 years. His fingers clenched the steering wheel as he watched the dim glow of their bedroom window. He had told himself he wouldn't come, told himself that he didn't need to see it for his own eyes. But suspicions had a way of eating a man alive, and tonight the hunger was unbearable. He saw the shadow move behind the curtains. Not just Rachel's silhouette, a second figure, taller, male. His stomach knotted. Even though he had prepared for this moment, even though he had spent weeks tracing the breadcrumbs of missed calls, abrupt changes in her schedule, and that distant, almost imperceptible coolness in her touch, nothing could have prepared him for the stark confirmation of betrayal. Michael pulled away before he did something reckless. He had been a detective long enough to know that anger clouded judgment. Instead, he parked at the nearby overlook and let the city lights blur into one as the weight of reality settled over him. Who was he without the marriage? Without the life they had built? Rachel had always been his anchor, his voice of reason, but now the woman he trusted most had shattered him in the quietest, cruelest way. The next morning, Rachel stood in the kitchen, coffee in hand, her expression unreadable. He had rehearsed 1,000 confrontations, but when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost detached. "Who is he?" Her fingers tightened around the ceramic mug. "Michael, don't. Just tell me." Her hesitation lasted too long. "Ethan." He exhaled sharply. Ethan was her co-worker, someone Michael had met more than once at office parties. It made sense now. The late nights, the last-minute work projects, the way she had pulled away from him even when she was right beside him. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered. "It was just things between us weren't the same, and I—" He held up a hand. "Stop. Don't try to make it about us. You made a choice." Rachel's eyes glistened. "I know. And I'm sorry. I was lost, and Ethan, he made me feel—" Michael stood abruptly. "Don't say it. I don't want to hear how he made you feel." The days that followed were a blur of silence and avoidance. He had options: divorce, revenge, forgiveness. The last seemed impossible, but so did letting go of everything they had shared. Then came the twist. A phone call from an old friend in law enforcement. "Michael, I think you should know, Ethan isn't who he says he is." Michael frowned. "What are you talking about?" "There's an ongoing investigation. He's been embezzling from the company. We've had suspicions for months. I didn't know Rachel was connected to him until now." Michael's stomach churned. Had Rachel been unknowingly tangled in something criminal? Or worse, had she known? That night. He confronted her again, this time with more than just betrayal on his mind. "How much do you know about Ethan's finances?" Rachel paled. "What?" "He's being investigated for fraud. Did you know?" She shook her head rapidly. No, I had no idea." And for the first time since he had discovered the affair, he believed her. The investigation unraveled swiftly. Ethan was arrested. Rachel was questioned but cleared. She cut all ties with him, but the damage had already been done. Michael stood at the threshold of their home, suitcase in hand. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Rachel met his gaze, her voice raw. "I understand. But if you ever decide you want to try, just know I won't give up on us." He walked away without answering. Some betrayals leave scars, too deep to heal. Others, given time, might become something else. Michael didn't know which category his pain would fall into, but as he drove away, he realized that for now, he didn't need an answer. Michael barely registered the drive across town. His mind was a storm, every thought circling back to the same dark conclusion. Ethan wasn't done. The man had too much to lose, and desperate people made reckless choices. When he reached the house, he parked down the street, scanning the neighborhood for anything out of place. The porch light flickered slightly in the breeze. The street was quiet, too quiet. His phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Rachel. He hesitated, then played it on speaker. "Michael, I think someone's been watching the house. I keep hearing noises outside. I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but..." The message cut off abruptly. His gut twisted. Michael was out of the car in an instant, hand on his holster as he approached the house. The front door was locked, but Rachel's car was in the driveway. She was inside. He knocked once. "Rachel, it's me." No answer. He knocked harder. "Rachel!" Still nothing. His instincts screamed at him. He stepped back, bracing himself, before ramming his shoulder into the door. The lock gave way with a crack, and he stumbled into the dimly lit foyer. A shattered glass lay on the floor, wine pooling across the tile. Then, a sound. A scuffle. A muffled gasp. From the living room. Michael drew his gun and moved quickly, his heart pounding. As he rounded the corner, he saw them, Rachel backed against the fireplace, wide-eyed and terrified, and Ethan, gripping her arm, his face twisted with something between anger and desperation. Michael leveled his gun. "Let her go!" Ethan's gaze flickered to him, then back to Rachel. "This is between us." Michael took a step closer. Steady. Controlled. "No, Ethan. It's over." Ethan hesitated, a flicker of something in his eyes. Calculation, a possible escape. Then suddenly he shoved Rachel aside and lunged for the back door. Michael didn't hesitate. A shot rang out. Ethan crumpled to the floor, clutching his leg, screaming in pain. Rachel gasped, hands covering her mouth as she stared at Michael. The room felt impossibly still. Michael exhaled sharply, lowering his gun. His hands weren't shaking. He had done what needed to be done. Sirens wailed in the distance, the flashing lights reflecting off the windows. Rachel turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Michael." He met her gaze, searching for something. Answers. Closure. Maybe. Even understanding. But all he felt was exhaustion. As the police stormed in and cuffed Ethan, as the medics arrived, as Rachel reached for him with hesitant hands, Michael found himself wondering, was this the end of their story? Or just another painful chapter? The house was a blur of flashing lights and murmured voices as officers secured the scene. Michael stood near the doorway, watching as Ethan was loaded onto a stretcher, clutching his leg, cursing under his breath. Rachel sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given her, her hands trembling in her lap. She hadn't spoken since the medics arrived. She hadn't needed to. Her eyes said enough: fear, shock, and something else beneath it all. Regret. Michael turned away. His partner, Detective James Carter, approached him, arms crossed. "You okay?" Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Carter exhaled. "Self-defense is clear. No one's going to question the shot." He glanced toward Rachel. "She's lucky you showed up when you did." Michael didn't answer. Instead, he watched as Ethan was loaded into the ambulance, his face twisted in pain. It should have felt like closure. It didn't. Carter shifted, lowering his voice. "Look, I know it's not my place, but what are you going to do about her?" Michael's jaw tensed. "I don't know." Carter nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Take care of yourself, man." When the officers cleared out, silence settled over the house again. Rachel finally spoke. "Are you leaving?" Michael turned to her, searching her face for something. Guilt, sorrow, hope. He saw all three. "I don't know." His voice was quiet, honest. "I came here to protect you. That's all I know right now." She swallowed. "I never wanted this, Michael. Any of it." He ran a hand through his hair. "Neither did I." A long silence stretched between them. Rachel's voice was almost a whisper. "Can we fix this?" Michael looked at her, really looked at her. The woman he had loved. The woman who had betrayed him. The woman he had just saved. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say no. Instead, he said the only thing he truly knew. I don't know. And for now, that was enough. Michael didn't stay the night. He couldn't. As soon as the last officer left, he walked out the front door, ignoring the way Rachel's eyes followed him, silently pleading. He had done what he came to do, kept her safe. But beyond that, he wasn't sure what was left of them. The next few days passed in a haze. Michael worked long hours at the precinct, trying to drown out the weight of everything. But no matter how many cases he buried himself in, his mind kept circling back to Rachel. He hadn't responded to her messages, hadn't driven by the house. But then, late one evening, he found himself outside their home again. This time, she was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, cradling a mug between her hands. She must have seen his car pull up because she didn't look surprised when he stepped out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then softly, Rachel said, "You keep showing up." Michael sighed. Yeah. A sad smile touched her lips. "Do you want to come inside?" He hesitated. He wanted to say no, to turn and leave before he lost himself in all the things they used to be. But then Rachel whispered, "Please." And something inside him cracked. Against his better judgment, he followed her in. The house was the same, but it felt different. The air between them was heavier now, weighed down by too many things left unsaid. Rachel sat on the couch, curling her legs beneath her. "I know you don't want to talk about it," she said, watching him carefully, "but I need you to know something." Michael leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Go ahead." She swallowed. "Ethan was a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake. But it was never about loving him. It was about feeling like I was disappearing." Michael's chest tightened. Rachel took a breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve that. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." Silence stretched between them. Then finally Michael said, "I don't know if love is enough." Rachel looked down, nodding slowly. "I know." Michael ran a hand through his hair. He was exhausted, of the fighting, of the pain, of the endless loop of memories. But the hardest part was knowing that despite everything, a part of him still wanted to believe her. Finally, he said, "I don't have an answer for us yet." Rachel met his gaze. "Then let's just sit here. No answers. No pressure." Michael hesitated. Then slowly, he sank onto the couch beside her. Not close enough to touch, but not far enough to leave. For tonight, that was enough. For now, they existed. In the space between forgiveness and goodbye, the silence between them stretched long into the night, neither one willing to break it. Rachel sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. Michael leaned back against the couch, eyes heavy with exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, there was no yelling, no accusations, no pleading, just quiet. And yet, beneath that quiet, the weight of everything unsaid lingered. Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember our first apartment?" Michael glanced at her. "Yeah." She smiled faintly, a sad, distant thing. "That tiny place with the leaky sink and the neighbors who fought louder than we ever did." Michael chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "They made us look like a fairy tale couple." Rachel let out a breath, something close to a laugh. "Back then, I really thought we had it all figured out." Michael didn't answer, because he had thought the same thing once, too. Rachel shifted, turning to look at him. "Do you think we could ever get back to that?" Michael met her gaze, searching for something, certainty, hope, anything that could make the answer easier. But the truth was, he didn't know. "I don't think we can go back," he admitted finally. "But I don't know if we can move forward, either." Rachel looked away, her fingers tightening around the blanket draped over her lap. "I miss you," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Michael exhaled slowly. He missed her too. He missed the way she used to trace circles on his wrist when she was nervous. He missed Sunday mornings tangled in the sheets, laughing at nothing. He missed the way she used to look at him before all of this, but he also missed the version of himself who hadn't been betrayed. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he said, the words raw, unfiltered. Rachel flinched, but she nodded. "I know." Another silence. Then cautiously she asked, "If I hadn't told you the truth, would you have wanted to know?" Michael frowned. "Of course I would have." Rachel bit her lip. "Even if it meant losing us?" He studied her carefully. "Rachel, we lost us the moment you chose him." She closed her eyes like she had been bracing for those words. "I know," she whispered. Michael sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He was so damn tired. Tired of being angry. Tired of hurting. Tired of not knowing whether he wanted to stay or walk away for good. Rachel turned to him, something fragile in her expression. "Would it be crazy if I asked you to stay tonight?" Michael stiffened. Not in their bedroom. Not as husband and wife. Just stay. He looked at her, at the quiet desperation in her eyes, and for the first time, he realized that she was just as lost as he was. After a long moment, he leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes. "I'll stay," he murmured, "but just for tonight." Rachel nodded, curling into the corner of the couch, as if she was afraid to ask for anything more. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, in the wreckage of what they used to be, they weren't ready to say goodbye just yet. Morning came slowly, stretching golden light across the living room. Michael stirred first, the stiffness in his back reminding him that he had fallen asleep on the couch. Rachel was still curled up in the opposite corner, her breathing steady, her face softer in sleep. For a brief, fleeting second, Michael could almost forget everything, almost. Then reality crashed back. The betrayal, the fight, the gunshot. Ethan. Michael exhaled and rubbed a hand over his face. He needed coffee. He needed clarity. He pushed himself up and walked to the kitchen, forcing himself to focus on the mundane, grinding the beans, filling the pot, waiting for the drip. The familiar routine helped, even if just a little. Rachel's voice came from behind him, still thick with sleep. "You stayed." Michael didn't turn around. "I said I would." A pause. "Thank you." He poured 2 cups, hesitated, then pushed one across the counter toward her. She accepted it carefully, like she wasn't sure if she deserved the offering. They stood in silence, sipping coffee, the air thick with unsaid things. Rachel was the first to speak. "Are you going back to your apartment?" Michael stared into his mug. "I don't know." "That seems to be the only answer we ever have anymore." Her voice was quiet, resigned. Michael finally looked at her. "What do you want me to say, Rachel? That everything's fine? That I can just pretend none of this happened?" Her grip tightened on the mug. "No. I don't want this to be the end." Michael let out a slow breath. "Maybe it already is." Rachel's throat worked as she swallowed. "Then why did you stay?" He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, and he just wasn't ready to admit it. She set her coffee down. "I meant what I said last night. I don't expect forgiveness, Michael, but I want to try. I want us to try." Michael looked at her, at the hope flickering behind the regret in her eyes. He wanted to believe in second chances, but some betrayals cut too deep. "I need time," he said finally. Rachel nodded, but he could see the fear in her expression, the fear that time might not be enough. Michael grabbed his keys. "I'll call you." Rachel watched him, her fingers twitching like she wanted to reach for him. But she didn't. And as Michael stepped outside into the cool morning air, he realized he still didn't know if he was walking away forever, or if, somehow, he'd find his way back. For now, all he had was the uncertain space between goodbye and maybe. The days that followed felt like limbo. Michael returned to his apartment, but it didn't feel like home. He worked late, drowning himself in case files and meaningless conversations with colleagues who didn't know, who couldn't know, what was unraveling inside him. Rachel called once. He let it go to voicemail. He listened to the message late that night standing in his kitchen with a beer in hand. "Hey, I don't know if you want to hear from me, but I wanted to say thank you for staying that night, for not walking away completely. I know you need space, and I'll give it to you. Just, if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Michael deleted the message before she could say goodbye. He wasn't ready to hear that from her. Not yet. A week passed. Then another. Michael told himself he was fine, that he was moving on, that Rachel's betrayal wasn't a wound anymore, just a scar. Then one evening, he found himself parked outside her house again. He didn't even remember driving there. Rachel was home. Her car was in the driveway, lights glowing, behind the curtains. For a long time, he just sat there, gripping the steering wheel. Was he here to talk? To fight? To end things for good? Before he could answer that, a shadow moved inside the house. A man. Michael's blood ran cold. For a split second, his mind filled with worst-case scenarios. Had Ethan come back? Was Rachel in danger again? Then the man stepped into view, a stranger. Mid-30s, dark hair, relaxed posture, a casual ease in the way he moved through his house. Michael's gut twisted. Rachel wasn't in danger. She had moved on. Something inside him clenched. Hard. He told himself it didn't matter, that he had no claim over her anymore, that he had been the one who walked away. But watching another man move through the home they built together, a sick, ugly feeling curled in his chest. Before he could think better of it, he was out of the car, crossing the street, knocking on the door. It wasn't Rachel who answered. It was him. The stranger frowned, confused. "Can I help you?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Where's Rachel?" The man's expression shifted slightly. "She's in the kitchen." He hesitated. "Are you Michael?" Michael stared at him, not bothering to answer. Before the tension could thicken, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening. "Michael?" He ignored the way her voice softened when she said his name. Rachel glanced at the man beside her, then back at Michael. She looked nervous. "What are you doing here?" Michael didn't know. Maybe he had come for closure. Maybe he had come to fight for something already lost. Or maybe he had come to see if there was still a place for him in her life, only to realize there wasn't. His pulse pounded in his ears. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "This is Adam," she said carefully. "He's a friend." Michael let out a slow breath. "Right," he said, his voice flat. "A friend." Rachel flinched. Adam looked between them, clearly aware of the tension. "I should go," he said, grabbing his jacket. "It was nice meeting you, Michael." Michael didn't respond. He barely looked at him as he walked past. The door shut, leaving only Rachel and Michael in the quiet tension of the house. Rachel exhaled. "He's just—" "Don't," Michael interrupted. His voice was calmer than he felt. "You don't have to explain." Rachel looked at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "Then why are you here?" Michael didn't answer, because suddenly he didn't know anymore. All he knew was that he had spent weeks convincing himself he was okay. But Watching another man in what used to be his home, standing in the space that used to be his life, he realized he wasn't. Rachel crossed her arms, exhaling slowly. "You don't get to be mad, Michael." Michael clenched his jaw. "I'm not mad." Rachel gave him a knowing look. "You showed up here unannounced. You're standing in my living room, staring at me like I did something wrong." He looked around, taking in the small changes. New cushions on the couch, fresh flowers on the table. Subtle, but enough to remind him that this wasn't their home anymore. It was hers. "I didn't expect you to move on so fast," he admitted, his voice rough. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Fast? It's been 2 months, Michael." "Doesn't feel like it." She shook her head. "And what about you? Have you been sitting in your apartment stewing, pretending you don't care while watching from a distance?" Michael bristled. "I haven't been watching." Rachel arched a brow. "Then what do you call this?" He didn't have an answer. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "I didn't plan this, Michael. I didn't expect to meet someone." Michael scoffed. "Right." Rachel's eyes flashed with something sharp. "You don't get to be this person, not after her." His stomach tightened. "Rachel, no!" She cut him off, stepping closer. "You walked away. I waited. I gave you space, hoping maybe you'd want to talk. But you didn't. You just disappeared." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. "I needed time." "You needed control." He flinched, but she wasn't wrong. Rachel sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Michael. I'm not asking for anything. But you don't get to walk in here and act like I betrayed you again." Michael swallowed hard, looking away. Rachel's voice softened. "Did you come here to say goodbye?" He didn't know. Maybe he had come to test the waters to see if there was still a thread connecting them. But Rachel had made her choice, and maybe, deep down, he had made his too. "I think I already did," he said quietly. Rachel's lips pressed together. She nodded once. "Then take care of yourself, Michael." Michael hesitated. There was so much he wanted to say, things that would never make a difference now. So instead, he just turned and walked to the door. This time, Rachel didn't stop him, and this time, he knew she never would. Michael drove through the quiet streets, his mind a tangled mess of emotions he didn't want to name. Regret, jealousy, loneliness. Rachel was right. He had disappeared. He had let the silence stretch between them, thinking that time and distance would make everything clearer. That if he ignored the wreckage, it would somehow fix itself. But life didn't work like that. Rachel had moved on, and now so would he. The next morning, Michael sat in his office, staring at his phone. He had scrolled to Rachel's number at least 3 times, his thumb hovering over the call button. He never pressed it. Instead, he tossed the phone onto his desk and focused on work. That was how it had to be. His inbox was full. The usual mix of case updates, reports, and internal memos. One email caught his attention, a follow-up from the detective assigned to Ethan's case. Michael frowned and opened it. Subject: Update on Ethan Carter, Michael. There's been a development you might want to be aware of. Ethan Carter has been making inquiries about Rachel. Nothing illegal, but he's been seen near her workplace and around her neighborhood. Just a heads up in case you want to pass it along. Michael's pulse spiked. Ethan was still lurking. Michael had done his best to push that part of the past away. He had trusted that after their last confrontation, Ethan would stay gone. Clearly, that was a mistake. Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Rachel had moved on, but that didn't mean she was safe. And whether she wanted his help or not, he wasn't about to let her deal with Ethan alone. He grabbed his phone, this time, not hesitating before dialing. Rachel picked up on the 3rd ring. "Michael?" He didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk.